The morning seemed like any other. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the schoolyard as the children gathered outside for their usual morning routine. The sound of laughter filled the air, accompanied by the soft rustle of backpacks and the occasional shout between friends. For most, it was another day of lessons, friendship, and youthful anticipation. But for one family, that day would mark the beginning of a nightmare, an event that would forever alter their lives. In the distance, a figure loomed near the gates, watching the children with an unsettling intensity. For some, the presence of Karen, the woman who lived next door, might have gone unnoticed, but for others, especially the ones who knew her history, it was a quiet warning. Karen had always been difficult to deal with, someone whose opinions and actions were as volatile as they were unprovoked. She had long held a grudge, not just against the families in the neighborhood, but against those she deemed different, weaker, or less than her standards. But on that fateful morning, no one could have predicted what was about to unfold. As the school bell rang, signaling the beginning of the day, the atmosphere suddenly shifted. The usual chatter seemed to fade as a strange tension filled the air. It was almost as if the world around them held its breath. And then, in an instant, everything changed. The sharp crack of a gunshot shattered the silence. It was so sudden, so deafening, that time seemed to stand still. The crowd of children scattered, some running in fear, others too stunned to move. The sound of the shot echoed, a reminder that something violent and incomprehensible had just occurred. And then, through the chaos, one truth became clear. The shot had been aimed at someone innocent, someone vulnerable, someone who had done nothing wrong. In the aftermath, panic set in. Parents rushed to the scene, teachers scrambled to secure their students, and emergency responders were called to the location. Amid the confusion, the focus shifted to one horrifying realization. Karen had fired the shot, but it wasn't just the act of violence that stunned everyone, it was the explanation that followed. Karen, in her attempt to justify her actions, would blame the teacher, accusing her of instigating the entire situation. The audacity of it all was almost too much to bear. The truth was clear to everyone, yet Karen's deflection would only add layers of complexity to an already tragic moment. The question now was not just about the immediate fallout, but about the deeper implications of what had happened. How had a peaceful morning turned into such an unimaginable tragedy? And what would happen next as the community and the family tried to make sense of it all? The road to justice, healing, and truth was just beginning, but the scars of that moment would last forever. Karen had always been a presence in the neighborhood, one that no one could ignore. Her sharp words and sharper stares made it clear that she wasn't someone to be crossed. Over the years, she had built a reputation for being difficult to deal with, and those who had the misfortune of interacting with her knew better than to challenge her. She was the type of person who saw herself as above others, with a misguided sense of entitlement and an obsessive desire to control everything and everyone around her. For years, the residents of the community had endured Karen's antics in silence, avoiding confrontation whenever possible. Her disdain for families like yours was no secret. As a mother, you had always done your best to shield your daughter from the harsh realities of the world, especially the ones that seemed to come from people who were supposed to be neighbors. Your daughter, with her disability, was no stranger to the world's cruelty, but you had done everything you could to ensure that she didn't become a target for those who might see her as different or less than. Your daughter had always been strong, more resilient than most people gave her credit for. Her spirit never wavered, despite the physical challenges she faced every day. Yet, she had never encountered someone like Karen, whose hatred seemed to know no bounds. It wasn't just that Karen found fault with your daughter's disability, it was that she saw it as a reason to criticize, to belittle, to push for the exclusion of anyone she deemed unworthy of her space. Over time, you had learned to keep your distance from Karen, not just for your own peace of mind, but for your daughter's well-being. The tension had been building for months, even years. Karen would watch from her window, her gaze never leaving your daughter, as if waiting for an opportunity to make her presence felt. You had always dismissed it as just another one of Karen's petty grievances, but deep down, you couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was brewing beneath the surface. Then, there were the moments that seemed to linger in your mind, the times when Karen had lashed out at others, sometimes without provocation. The time she had yelled at a child for playing too near her driveway, or the time she complained to the HOA about someone's flower bed being too close to her fence. She had a way of turning the smallest inconvenience into an accusation, making people feel as if they were constantly on edge. It was never a direct confrontation, but rather a constant passive-aggressive tension that followed her wherever she went. Despite all of this, you had never imagined that the situation would escalate to the point it had. You knew that Karen's behavior was erratic, but the idea that she would go so far as to harm someone, let alone shoot your daughter, seemed unimaginable. And yet here you were, standing at the gates of your daughter's school, hearing the echoes of that gunshot ring in your ears, the horror of it all sinking in. As the authorities began their investigation, the focus quickly shifted to the events leading up to the shooting. There had been an altercation just hours before, one that seemed trivial at the time, but in hindsight had been a warning sign. Your daughter, trying to enjoy her morning like any other child, had simply asked Karen about the rules for parking in the neighborhood. It was a polite question, asked with genuine curiosity, yet it was enough to set Karen off. In her mind, this simple inquiry was an affront to her authority, an intrusion into her carefully constructed world. Karen's response had been as venomous as it was unexpected. She had insisted that your daughter was overstepping her bounds, that she was somehow threatening the peace of the neighborhood by daring to question her. And yet, despite the absurdity of her reasoning, Karen's anger had been palpable. It was this moment that marked the beginning of the tragic series of events that would follow. What should have been a simple conversation about parking had instead become the catalyst for a confrontation that no one could have predicted. But it was not just the question itself that would haunt everyone. It was Karen's response, the way she chose to escalate everything with the touch of a button, and soon after, with a shot that would change everything. The days following the incident were a blur. What had once been an ordinary neighborhood was now filled with whispers, speculation, and mounting fear. Neighbors who had kept their distance from Karen for years found themselves suddenly thrown into the chaos that surrounded her actions. The air was thick with tension, and no one knew where it would lead next. For your family, it was no longer about just dealing with the trauma of the shooting. It was about what was to come, the fallout, the blame, and the fight for justice. The police were quick to arrive, but even their presence seemed unable to immediately quell the rising storm. Karen, as expected, had a story to tell. She claimed that she had felt threatened, that she was acting in self-defense. In her version of the events, your daughter's presence, her wheelchair, her disability, had been an unexpected and overwhelming threat to Karen's sense of safety. The idea that someone like your daughter, who had always been kind and non-confrontational, could be painted as a danger was ludicrous to you. But Karen's words were delivered with such conviction that they gave others pause. Karen's accusation was that your daughter had been instigating the situation, that she had been belligerent in some way. This narrative, spun from nothing but her twisted perception, quickly began to gain traction. The first responders who arrived at the scene were professional and efficient, but even they seemed uncertain at times. How could someone so clearly vulnerable, someone in a wheelchair, ever pose a real threat? But Karen's words had power. They planted seeds of doubt in the minds of those who weren't directly involved. Your daughter's teacher, Ms. Johnson, had witnessed the entire event. She had seen Karen's behavior escalate long before the shooting ever took place. But despite her attempts to reassure everyone of the facts, Karen's manipulation of the situation continued unabated. With each passing hour, Karen twisted the narrative, her accusations growing more outrageous. She blamed Ms. Johnson for instigating the whole thing, claiming that the teacher had somehow encouraged your daughter to approach her. The absurdity of it all was maddening. For you, the mother, the frustration was unbearable. You had spent years protecting your daughter from the cruelties of the world, only to have someone like Karen try to distort reality to fit her own narrative. It wasn't enough that she had fired a gun at an innocent child. Now she was manipulating the truth in an attempt to escape the consequences of her actions. You could feel your own blood boil as the world seemed to turn a blind eye to the injustice unfolding in front of you. In the midst of this chaos, the emotions ran high. Your daughter, normally the picture of resilience, now struggled to make sense of the cruelty she had been subjected to. The once vibrant and confident child now carried an unfamiliar weight, fear, confusion, and betrayal. It was a heavy burden to bear, knowing that the very system that should have protected her seemed to be swayed by the lies of someone like Karen. The tension wasn't just between your family and Karen, it was everywhere. The community was divided. Some believed Karen's version of events, while others knew the truth but were afraid to speak out. Those who had long been afraid of Karen's wrath now whispered in corners, unsure of where to stand. The very foundation of trust within the community seemed to crack under the weight of the conflict. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, Karen went further. She sent letters to the school board, to local media, accusing everyone from the teacher to the principal of fostering a hostile environment and encouraging your daughter's actions. The manipulation had reached new heights, and each passing day added another layer to the twisted web she was weaving. It wasn't just about the shooting anymore. It was about the battle for the truth. And the stakes couldn't have been higher. For you, every conversation with the authorities, every encounter with your neighbors, felt like a fight. The truth was being buried beneath a mound of lies, and it was up to you to uncover it, to make the world see what Karen had done. But the road ahead seemed long, and the more you pushed back, the more the world seemed to favor her distorted version of reality. And in that moment, it was clear the real battle was just beginning. It happened in an instant, too quickly for anyone to fully process or react. The air, once filled with the hum of the school day, was now pierced by the deafening crack of a gunshot. It was the sound of a life being irreversibly changed, the sound of an act that none of us could have predicted. The chaos that followed felt like an eternity. In the moments before the shot was fired, there was nothing but confusion. The children, gathered in the schoolyard, were oblivious to what was unfolding. Their laughter, their voices, their energy were part of a normal day, part of the rhythm of school life. But for those of us who had been present long enough to notice, there was something about Karen's demeanor that felt wrong. There was a coldness in her eyes, a calculated tension in her posture that stood in stark contrast to the joyful innocence of the children around her. Your daughter, Grace, was simply walking toward the entrance of the school. She had no intention of causing trouble. She wasn't trying to provoke anyone. She had every right to be there, just like every other child. Yet, as her wheelchair rolled quietly over the paved sidewalk, it was clear that Karen had been watching her every move, her gaze never wavering from the young girl who dared to live in a world that Karen had built for herself, a world where control and judgment ruled. When Grace approached the gate, Karen stepped into her path, blocking her way. There was no warning, no negotiation, just an unspoken confrontation. Grace paused, unsure of why this woman was standing there as she always did. Karen's face twisted into a mask of disdain, and for a moment, it seemed like the world held its breath. Then came the words that nobody would ever forget. "You don't belong here," Karen spat, her voice low and threatening. "You're just a disruption to everything around here. You shouldn't even be in this neighborhood." Grace, as calm and collected as always, simply tried to move around her, her eyes downcast in an effort to avoid confrontation. But Karen wouldn't let it go. She pushed forward, her anger growing, escalating in an instant. "Don't ignore me," she screamed, her voice rising in fury. "I told you before to stay away. Stay out of my sight." Before anyone could intervene, Karen pulled something from her jacket, something that shimmered dangerously in the morning light. A gun. It happened so fast that nobody could fully comprehend it. The shot rang out, its deafening crack filling the space between the two of them, slicing through the air like a blade. The sound of the gunshot was immediately followed by a collective gasp, followed by pure, unfiltered chaos. Children screamed and scattered in all directions, their hearts racing in fear and confusion. Teachers rushed to shield their students, pushing them into classrooms, but none of them were prepared for what had just happened. And there, in the midst of the madness, was Grace. She had been hit. The bullet, fired with deadly intent, struck her in the chest. The force of it caused her wheelchair to spin, the momentum carrying her backward, and she crumpled to the ground in a heap. The sight of her, lying motionless on the pavement, was something none of us could shake off. She was vulnerable, defenseless, yet still, she had been attacked. Panic spread like wildfire through the school grounds. Teachers and staff rushed to her side, some dialing emergency services, others trying to apply pressure to the wound. But the shock of it all had left everyone paralyzed, unsure of what to do. And amid all of this, Karen stood there, her chest heaving with ragged breaths, her eyes wide but strangely unfazed. The chaos, the blood, the terror, it seemed to have no effect on her. It was as though, in that moment, she was detached from the humanity of it all, as if she were an observer rather than a participant in the nightmare she had just created. As the first responders arrived, the scene became even more surreal. They worked quickly, their experience kicking in as they tended to Grace, but the magnitude of the event was already set in motion. The world had already changed. Grace's life, your family's world, and the entire community were no longer the same. And through all of it, one question loomed large. Why? Why would Karen, a woman who had always been a source of irritation, take it this far? What could possibly justify her actions? The answers, however, seemed as elusive as the truth itself. But in the moment, that didn't matter. The only thing that mattered now was Grace, the child who had become the target of someone's cruel and senseless rage. The journey to uncover the truth, to find justice, had just begun. And the fight for your daughter's life was only the beginning. The minutes after the shot were a whirlwind of noise, confusion, and panic. The calm, ordinary morning had given way to chaos. As emergency responders swarmed the scene, there was no way to tell how much time had passed. The seconds felt like hours, and the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Your mind, still struggling to comprehend the horror of what had just happened, was spinning. Grace, your precious daughter, was lying there motionless while the world around you seemed to fall apart. The first responders were quick, their training kicking in as they moved to stabilize Grace. But even in the face of such professionalism, you couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. As they worked to save her, the sounds of the sirens filled the air, a stark reminder that things were slipping out of control. It was all happening too fast for you to process, too much for your heart to bear. You moved closer to Grace, despite the attempts of the authorities to keep you back. Every part of you wanted to reach her, to hold her hand, to tell her that everything would be okay. But you could only stand there, watching as the paramedics carefully loaded her onto the stretcher. Blood soaked through the fabric of her clothes, staining the pavement beneath her. It was the kind of image that would haunt you forever, the kind of image that would never fade from your mind. Around you, the school had descended into chaos. Children, some crying and others too stunned to react, were being ushered into classrooms by their teachers. Parents were arriving, some frantic with worry, others frozen in disbelief. The air was thick with questions, but no one had the answers. Everyone was looking for someone to blame, and at that moment, the answer seemed obvious. Karen. As Grace was rushed to the hospital, the community began to gather. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers had begun to make their way to the school, drawn by the sirens and the news spreading like wildfire. Your mind was still reeling from the shock, but you had to stay focused. You had to think clearly for Grace. She was fighting for her life, and you couldn't afford to let your emotions take over. Yet, as you stood in the midst of the chaos, one thing became increasingly clear. Karen had already begun her version of events. The police had not yet fully questioned her, but that didn't matter. Karen had taken it upon herself to spin her own narrative, one where she was the victim. As the crowd began to settle, you could hear her voice above the others, her words filled with an unsettling calm. I had to do it, Karen was saying, her voice almost eerily composed. She was a threat, a danger to the school. She was instigating a confrontation. I felt I had no choice. The audacity of her words took your breath away. The sheer gall to stand there, in the aftermath of what she had just done, and claim self-defense was beyond comprehension. She didn't seem to care that she had just shot a disabled child in front of dozens of witnesses. Instead, she was playing the part of the aggrieved party, the one who had been wronged, the one who had been forced to defend herself. The more you heard her speak, the more enraged you became. How could anyone believe her? How could anyone allow her to spin this tragedy into something she could justify? But the reality was that her words were already beginning to plant seeds of doubt. Some of the bystanders looked uncertain, as if they were waiting for more information to come out. You knew that Karen's lies would only escalate as time went on. She would twist every detail, manipulate every fact, until the world believed her version of the story. But you weren't about to let that happen. This wasn't just about the shooting, it was about your daughter's life, her future, and the fight to make sure justice was served. The shock of it all was starting to wear off, replaced by a cold, hard determination. Karen had started the fire, but you were going to be the one to put it out. You couldn't afford to let her lies stand. Grace deserved better, and you weren't going to rest until the truth was revealed. But as the sirens faded and the crowds dispersed, one question lingered in your mind. How far would Karen go to protect herself? And just how far would you have to go to ensure that Grace's voice was heard? The battle for justice had only just begun, but the stakes had never been higher. The days that followed Grace's shooting were filled with an unsettling silence, one that contrasted sharply with the turmoil that raged inside you. The hospital room where Grace was recovering was quiet, too quiet. The constant beeping of the machines that monitored her vital signs was the only sound that seemed to break through the suffocating tension in the air. Your daughter was alive, but that didn't feel like enough. There was so much more to this story, so much more that had been shattered in that one moment. It wasn't just the physical trauma Grace had suffered that you had to grapple with. It was the fact that Karen, the woman who had caused this nightmare, had already begun spinning her own web of lies. From the very first moment, she had refused to take responsibility for what she had done. Instead, she deflected, twisted the truth, and painted herself as a victim in the eyes of anyone who would listen. Karen's version of events quickly gained traction, and you found yourself fighting a battle on two fronts. The first was the battle for Grace's life, the physical fight to help her heal. But the second, far more insidious battle was one for the truth. In Karen's mind, she hadn't shot an innocent child, she had merely protected herself from what she claimed was an impending threat. She insisted that Grace had been acting erratically, that her disability had made her seem dangerous, and that Karen had only fired in self-defense. The sheer audacity of her words made your blood boil. As the story spread through the neighborhood and into the media, Karen's narrative was being picked up by people who were quick to believe her. After all, she was well known in the community. Many of the neighbors, who had witnessed her volatile behavior in the past, found themselves torn between what they knew about her and the version of events she was selling. Her words seemed to resonate with some, particularly those who had never really understood the dynamics of living with a disability. For them, Karen's arguments, however distorted, made sense. They didn't see the full picture, they only saw a scared woman reacting to a situation she couldn't control. The most damaging part of Karen's story, though, was her accusation that the teacher, Ms. Johnson, had instigated the entire incident. According to Karen, it was the teacher's insistence on allowing Grace to approach her in the first place that had led to the confrontation. She claimed that Ms. Johnson had made it seem as if Grace's presence was somehow necessary in the situation. In her version of events, Ms. Johnson had forced the interaction, pushing Karen into a position where she had no choice but to act in self-defense. To say that the teacher was stunned by these accusations would be an understatement. Ms. Johnson had been a calm and composed presence in the midst of the chaos. She had tried as best as she could to keep the situation from escalating. She had watched Karen grow increasingly agitated, but never once had she expected things to spiral to the point of violence. Now, not only was she facing the trauma of what had happened, but she was also being painted as the one responsible for provoking Karen's behavior. As the accusations continued to mount, the pressure on Ms. Johnson grew unbearable. The school administration, despite their initial support, began to waver. They were forced to take a step back, unsure of how to navigate the storm Karen was stirring. The community, divided by the conflicting stories, became increasingly polarized. Some saw Karen as a victim of an unjust situation, while others knew the truth, that she had crossed a line no one should ever have crossed. The more you thought about it, the more you realized that Karen wasn't just manipulating the facts, she was trying to reshape the entire narrative to suit her own agenda. She wanted control over the story, to make it seem as though she had been the one wronged. In her mind, she had done nothing wrong. In her mind, she was simply protecting herself from a world that she believed was out to get her. But your anger was tempered by the realization that this wasn't just about Karen anymore. This was about Grace. This was about making sure that the truth, your truth, was heard. The battle for justice was now one of not just physical recovery, but emotional survival. It was a fight for your daughter's dignity and for the peace of mind she deserved. You knew that Karen's lies would not be easy to dismantle. They were already taking root, spreading far beyond the immediate circle of a neighborhood. But as much as you wanted to give in to the urge to shout her down, to expose her for the manipulator she was, you realized that the path to justice would require more than just anger. It would require strategy, persistence, and a commitment to the truth that would eventually come to light. But the truth wasn't just something you would find, it was something you would have to fight for every step of the way. As the days passed, the weight of the situation began to sink deeper into your family's bones. The constant tension in the air, the uncertainty about Grace's recovery, and the unrelenting pressure from Karen's false narrative were all too much to bear. You were trying to hold everything together, but it felt as though the walls were closing in on you from every direction. Grace, though physically stable for the time being, was mentally and emotionally shattered. She had always been a fighter, her strength inspiring you every single day. But now, the young girl who had once faced life's challenges with quiet resilience was now a prisoner of fear and confusion. The shooting had not only hurt her physically, but had stolen her peace. For days, she had been withdrawn, unable to understand why anyone would do such a thing to her. Despite her struggles, Grace never let herself fully succumb to despair. When you spoke to her, she would try to smile, to comfort you in her way. "I'll be okay, Mom," she would say, her voice small but resolute. But you could see the cracks in her composure, the lingering fear, the nightmares that had become a nightly ritual, the constant looking over her shoulder, as if expecting another attack. Your family, too, was feeling the strain. Your husband, who had always been the rock of the family, had become increasingly distant, his quiet rage simmering beneath the surface. He was consumed with the need to protect his daughter, to make sure she didn't feel abandoned in her pain. But the situation was beyond what he or anyone could handle alone. The guilt he felt for not being there when it happened, for not preventing it, was something that haunted him at every turn. Then there was your own internal struggle. You were torn between the roles of caretaker and warrior. On the one hand, you were trying to comfort your daughter, to help her heal physically and emotionally. On the other hand, you were navigating a battle you had never expected, the fight for justice, the constant legal consultations, the medical appointments, the media attention. It was all a lot to manage. But despite the overwhelming nature of it all, you found solace in the support system that surrounded you. Your friends, your extended family, and even neighbors who had seen the truth came together to lend their strength. They offered their help in whatever ways they could, helping with Grace's schoolwork, organizing fundraisers for her recovery, or simply providing a shoulder to cry on. Some even spoke out in public, offering testimonies about Karen's long history of erratic behavior, something that painted a stark contrast to the version of events Karen was pushing. One neighbor, a woman named Evelyn, became a crucial ally. She had witnessed Karen's temper tantrums in the past and had seen firsthand how she treated people who, in her mind, weren't worthy of her time or attention. Evelyn's willingness to speak out against Karen's accusations helped give your family the momentum it needed to start turning the tide. And then there were the moments when Grace's younger brother, Ben, proved to be the light in the midst of the darkness. Though just a child himself, he showed an unexpected level of maturity and tenderness in his sister's time of need. He would sit beside her, holding her hand, his small voice filled with warmth. "It's okay, Grace," he'd say. "Mom and Dad are here and I'm here too. We'll get through this together." It was Ben's quiet strength that reminded you of why you had to keep fighting. Despite everything, despite the pain and the fear, Grace still had her family, still had love and care to help her through this. In the midst of the chaos and confusion, this love became your family's greatest weapon. The community's support, your family's resilience, and the bond between siblings became the foundation upon which you would build the fight for justice. Every word of encouragement, every act of kindness, every step toward normalcy helped to strengthen the resolve you needed. It wasn't just about surviving the day, it was about rising above it. You couldn't let Karen's lies define Grace's story or allow her actions to leave a permanent scar. Your daughter deserved more than that. She deserved peace, and more than anything, she deserved the truth to be heard loud and clear, for the world to know exactly what had happened that day. The fight ahead would be long, filled with legal battles, media scrutiny, and the overwhelming emotional toll of reliving the events. But with your family, your community, and the truth on your side, you knew one thing for certain: you would not stop. The support that surrounded you was the shield, and the truth was the sword. Together, they would be enough to face whatever came next. In the days following the shooting, as the storm of accusations and confusion swirled around, one voice remained steadfast, though often drowned out by the chaos. That voice was Ms. Johnson's, the teacher who had witnessed everything. She had seen Grace approach Karen with nothing but a simple, polite question, only to be met with hostility, and she had watched in horror as Karen escalated the situation to unimaginable violence. For Ms. Johnson, the events of that day were seared into her memory. She had been on duty that morning, overseeing the children as they filtered in for the start of the school day. As always, her attention was divided between the children, the staff, and the general flow of activity. But when Grace approached Karen, she couldn't help but notice the tension that hung in the air. Karen's body language had been hostile from the start, her arms crossed tightly, her gaze cold and dismissive. At first, Ms. Johnson had thought it was just another one of Karen's usual tirades. Karen had a reputation in the neighborhood for her quick temper and her tendency to overreact to minor situations, and the teacher had grown accustomed to seeing her cause trouble. But as the confrontation unfolded, something didn't sit right. Karen's voice had grown louder, sharper, and soon it became clear that this wasn't a typical dispute. Grace, always respectful, had tried to de-escalate the situation by retreating, but Karen wouldn't allow it. The words she hurled at the young girl were cruel and unnecessary, and it was only when Karen started to advance toward Grace that Ms. Johnson had felt a rush of panic. As the teacher had moved closer, she had realized the danger was real. This wasn't just an angry neighbor. This was a woman who might be willing to do something drastic. When Karen pulled out the gun, Ms. Johnson's heart had dropped into her stomach. There was no time to react, no time to protect Grace, to stop what was happening. She could only stand there, frozen, watching as Karen's hand rose and the gunshot rang out. The scene afterward was a blur of frantic action. Ms. Johnson had immediately rushed to Grace's side, calling out to others for help. She had tried to comfort Grace, holding her hand as the young girl's breathing became shallow. But even as the paramedics arrived and rushed Grace away, one thought consumed her. Why had Karen done this? In the days that followed, as Karen began spinning her lies and accusations, Ms. Johnson found herself caught in the whirlwind. Karen had, of course, attempted to turn the blame onto her, accusing her of instigating the situation. She claimed that Ms. Johnson had pushed Grace too hard, that she had encouraged her to approach the volatile Karen and ask questions. In Karen's version of events, it was as if she had been forced into a corner and had no choice but to act. But this portrayal was a distortion of the truth. Ms. Johnson knew that she had done nothing wrong. She had only tried to guide the children to protect them from unnecessary conflict. The truth was simple. Grace had approached Karen with a question, and Karen had responded with aggression. The violence that followed had nothing to do with Ms. Johnson and everything to do with Karen's refusal to control her own emotions. Yet, despite the simplicity of the facts, Karen's narrative began to take root, and soon enough, there were people who were questioning Ms. Johnson's involvement. The worst part for Ms. Johnson was the feeling of helplessness. She had never expected to be thrust into such a scandal, to be painted as a villain when all she had done was try to protect her students. The accusations stung, and the weight of them was unbearable. How could anyone believe that she had instigated such a tragedy? How could anyone believe that she had encouraged a situation that would lead to her student being shot? Despite the mounting pressure, Ms. Johnson remained resolute. She knew the truth, and she would stand by it no matter what. She spoke to the authorities, provided her account of the events, and made it clear that she had acted in good faith. Yet, even as she did so, she knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Karen's influence in the community was undeniable, and she had a knack for twisting the truth to her advantage. But Ms. Johnson would not back down. She couldn't. In the end, the truth would have to prevail. And as the battle continued, Ms. Johnson vowed to stay strong, not just for her own sake, but for Grace. The fight wasn't over, and she knew it would take more than just her words to overcome Karen's lies. But she had to believe that justice would win out in the end, and that Grace, the innocent victim in all of this, would not be silenced by the manipulation of someone so callous and cruel. As the weeks dragged on, the weight of Karen's manipulation became increasingly suffocating. Her version of events was everywhere. It spread like wildfire across the media, through neighborhood gossip, and even into the halls of local schools. What had started as an open and shut case of self-defense turned into something far more complicated. The truth, as clear as it seemed to you, was buried beneath layers of lies, half-truths, and public pressure. The legal system, which should have been your ally in this fight for justice, was now a battleground in itself. With Karen maintaining her narrative of self-defense and the community divided, your family's fight to expose the truth had become a long and complicated legal battle. The authorities were still investigating, but the longer it dragged on, the more it felt as though Karen was winning the fight for public opinion. You had no idea how things had gotten so out of control. You had always believed that justice was something that would eventually prevail, that the facts would come to light, and the truth would be recognized. But as the legal documents piled up, as attorneys began to dissect every detail of that fateful day, you felt more and more like you were sinking into a hole that you couldn't climb out of. The day the district attorney's office called you in for a meeting marked the beginning of the turning point. It was an afternoon you will never forget. You arrived at the office, nerves tense but determined, hoping that your persistence in telling Grace's story would be enough to sway the tide. As you sat across from the prosecutor, she was kind but blunt. "We need evidence, something concrete. Your words, Grace's words, and Ms. Johnson's account are powerful, but they're not enough. We need hard proof that Karen acted recklessly and that her actions were not self-defense, as she claims." It was then that the full weight of the situation hit you. The case was not just about Karen's actions, it was about how the legal system viewed those actions. Would they see her as the unhinged woman she was? Or would they believe her manipulated version of events, that she acted out of fear? Your daughter's life and your family's pursuit of justice now rested on this thin thread. A shift had begun in the case as Karen's history of aggression and manipulation started to come to light. Neighbors who had kept quiet before now began to speak out. Evelyn, the neighbor who had been a silent witness to much of Karen's behavior over the years, came forward. She was willing to testify about Karen's prior outbursts, how she had always been quick to escalate minor issues into major conflicts. This was a breakthrough, And for the first time, it felt like the narrative was beginning to shift in your favor. The district attorney also suggested that the gun used in the shooting be tested for prints and other forensic evidence. With Karen's reckless behavior becoming more apparent, it was clear that she had been playing a dangerous game of power, one that might not have started with the shooting, but had certainly culminated in it. However, the process was painfully slow. Weeks turned into months as each piece of the puzzle was painstakingly put together. The courtroom drama, which had initially seemed distant, now loomed closer with every passing day. You, your husband, and Grace were all caught in a cycle of waiting for the truth to emerge. But with each new development came a deeper realization. The fight for justice wasn't just a matter of truth, it was a matter of public perception. Karen was not going down without a fight. Her lawyers, well versed in manipulation and public relations, continued to spin the narrative that she had acted in self defense. They painted Grace as the instigator, claiming she had been aggressive toward Karen, demanding to know her intentions. They even suggested that Grace's disability had somehow contributed to the threatening nature of her presence, an angle that enraged you but also made you realize just how deep the manipulation ran. In the midst of the growing legal tension, one fact remained undeniable. Karen had shot an innocent child, and no amount of rewriting the story could change that. As you spent your nights combing through legal documents, working with your attorney to build the case, the realization hit you. This was not just a fight for Grace's justice. It was a fight to make sure that no one ever again could use their power and privilege to harm someone innocent without consequences. But with the pressure mounting, the uncertainty lingering, and the stakes higher than ever, the road ahead seemed daunting. The truth was there, hiding behind the layers of legal red tape and Karen's endless manipulation. You knew that if you wanted to win this battle, you had to stay resolute, stay united, and never lose sight of the one thing that mattered most. Grace deserved justice, and you would do whatever it took to make sure she got it. The legal journey was far from over, but with each step, you could feel the momentum building. Karen's lies were beginning to crack, and as the truth began to push through, the hope for justice became more than just a distant dream. It was something you could almost reach out and touch. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. After months of investigation, public scrutiny, and painstaking legal work, the day of the trial had finally arrived. It was the moment when everything would be laid bare, where the truth would either be upheld or buried under the weight of manipulation and deceit. As you walked into the courtroom with your family, your heart pounded in your chest. Grace, though sitting in the back with her father, had grown stronger in the past weeks. She still bore the emotional scars of that day, but her determination to see justice done shone through her eyes. The sense of urgency that had driven you throughout the process was now sharper than ever. The prosecution had spent days laying out the facts, Karen's long history of aggression, her manipulative behavior, and her refusal to take responsibility for her actions. With Evelyn's testimony and the physical evidence, they had built a case that painted Karen as a woman who, rather than protecting herself, had used her power to harm an innocent child. The defense, on the other hand, clung to their argument that Karen had acted out of fear, that Grace's mere presence had been a threat that justified the shooting. But with each passing hour, the cracks in Karen's defense began to show. The jury could see it too, the inconsistencies, the manipulation, the refusal to accept any responsibility. The turning point came when Karen herself took the stand. Her calm demeanor, which had been so unsettling in the aftermath of the shooting, was now something that worked against her. She tried to maintain an air of authority, telling the jury how she had been forced to act when she felt threatened by Grace. But as the prosecutor began to tear apart her story, the facade started to crumble. "Miss Karen, you say that Grace was threatening," the prosecutor asked, his voice steady but cutting, "but you've already admitted that she never made any threatening gestures or actions. In fact, you've been described as instigating the situation by blocking her path and raising your voice first. Can you explain why you thought shooting her was the only way to handle that situation?" The courtroom grew silent. All eyes were on Karen. Her face paled, and for the first time, She seemed to falter. Her words became more defensive, more erratic, as she struggled to hold onto the narrative she had carefully crafted. The prosecutor pressed on, presenting evidence from her past, including complaints from neighbors and authorities about her volatile behavior. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of someone who had long felt entitled to control her environment through fear, someone who had no qualms about using violence to get what she wanted. The defense tried to counter with Karen's version of events, but it was becoming increasingly clear that her story didn't add up. The jury could see it, and so could the judge. By the time the defense rested its case, Karen's credibility had been shattered. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. You sat there, your hands trembling, as you tried to stay focused on the proceedings. Every word spoken, every gesture made carried weight. The fight for Grace's justice was at its peak, and you knew that the next few moments would determine everything. As the judge called for a recess, you found yourself alone for a moment, standing in the hallway with your husband and Grace. The uncertainty of it all still loomed heavy, but something inside you had shifted. The truth was out. Karen's lies were unraveling. The justice you had fought so hard for was finally within reach. When the courtroom reconvened, the judge began his instructions to the jury. You have heard the evidence, and you have seen the arguments on both sides. It is now your duty to deliberate and reach a verdict. You must consider whether Karen's actions were justified, or whether, as the prosecution has argued, her behavior went far beyond what any reasonable person would deem acceptable. The minutes dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. Your mind raced as you thought about everything that had brought you to this moment, the pain, the struggles, the sleepless nights. But through it all, one thing had remained constant: your commitment to seeing Grace through this, to ensuring that her voice was heard. Finally, after what felt like hours, the jury returned. The room held its breath as the foreman stood, clutching the verdict. When the words came, they were sharp, direct, and filled with the clarity of truth. We, the jury, find the defendant, Karen, guilty of aggravated assault and unlawful use of a firearm. A wave of relief washed over you, so overwhelming that for a moment you could barely stand. Grace, who had been quietly sitting beside you, let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. Her father squeezed her hand, and the two of them shared a look that said everything words couldn't express. The weight that had been crushing your family for so long had finally lifted, and with it, a sense of justice had been served. But even in that moment of triumph, the victory felt bittersweet. The truth had won, yes, but the damage done, both physical and emotional, would remain with you all. It would take time to heal, to rebuild, and to reclaim the peace that had been stolen from you. But for now, the most important thing was clear. Karen's manipulation, her violence, her lies had all been exposed, and in the end, justice had been done for Grace. The trial had ended, and the guilty verdict against Karen brought a sense of justice to your family, but it didn't bring the complete closure you had hoped for. The scars left by that fateful day weren't something that could be erased by a simple ruling. The pain, the fear, the trauma, those were things that would linger long after the courtroom doors had closed. But even in the face of those lingering shadows, there was a new sense of peace beginning to take root. Grace's recovery was slow, but it was happening. Physically, she had healed more than anyone expected after the gunshot. But emotionally, the road ahead would be far longer. She struggled with nightmares, with the fear that she might never truly feel safe again. Her resilience, though, had never been more evident. Each day she took one small step forward, even if it didn't always feel like progress. And as a mother, you stood by her every step of the way, offering comfort and reassurance when the fear seemed too much to bear. You had always known that the road to healing would be difficult, but you had underestimated the strength it would take to help her heal emotionally. There were days when she would cry in your arms, asking why someone could do this to her, asking what she had done to deserve it. Those moments broke your heart, but they also solidified your resolve to help her reclaim her life piece by piece. The community, too, began to heal. The fractures that Karen's actions had created were slowly mended. Neighbors who had once turned a blind eye to her behavior now rallied together, offering their support to your family and standing against the hate and divisiveness that Karen had spread. Evelyn's testimony, along with others who had witnessed Karen's long history of aggression, had helped build a bridge of understanding among those who had once been too afraid to speak out. For you and your husband, the fight for justice had not only been about grace, it had been about the values you wanted to instill in your children: truth, resilience, and the importance of standing up for what is right no matter the odds. Watching Grace begin to heal, seeing her regain some semblance of peace, made every battle worth it. And though the scars of the past would always remain, you could take comfort in knowing that you had fought for her, that you had protected her from the cruelty of the world. Looking back, there was a sense of reflection on everything that had happened, on the emotional roller coaster you had been on, and on the lessons learned. The system had worked, but only because you had refused to let go. You had taken the fight into your own hands, never allowing Karen's lies to take root. The victory wasn't just in the verdict, it was in the fact that your family had stayed strong, had weathered the storm together. As you sat with Grace on the couch one evening, her head resting on your shoulder, you realized that this was the moment of true healing, the moment when you knew that no matter what the world threw at her, she had the strength to overcome it. The road had been long and difficult, but it had also shown you the power of perseverance, the importance of speaking the truth, and the unbreakable bond of family. For now, there was peace. The world had tried to tear your family apart, but you had emerged stronger than ever. And with that peace, you knew that the future would be brighter, not just for Grace, but for all of you. As you reflect on everything that has unfolded, you can't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. The road to justice was long and grueling, but it was also one of growth, strength, and resilience. Your family had weathered the storm and emerged victorious, and for that, you couldn't be more thankful. You had fought for Grace, for a future, and for the truth, and now it was time for others to hear that same message. The story of what happened that day, the shooting, the lies, the manipulation, and the fight for justice, isn't just about your family. It's a story about every individual who has ever been silenced, every victim of injustice who has had their voice taken away. It's a story about how important it is to stand up for what is right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Karen's lies might have been loud, but the truth was louder. And now, the truth would continue to echo in every corner of your life, empowering you and your family to move forward with strength and courage. So, as you look ahead, you know that the battle doesn't end here. There are still so many people out there who need to hear your story. And while you may never fully erase the scars that have been left on your hearts, you can use this experience to inspire others to fight for their own justice, to stand up for what's right, and to never back down in the face of adversity. If you've been moved by this story, remember, the fight for truth, for justice, is ongoing. Share this story with others who need to hear it. Stand with those who can't stand for themselves. And together, let's make the world a better place, one truth at a time. As you reflect on everything that has unfolded, one thing becomes clear. The journey for justice is never easy, but it is always worth fighting for. The battle your family faced wasn't just about a single moment. It was about standing up for what's right and finding the strength to push through even when the odds were against you. Your story is a testament to the power of truth and resilience, and it's one that needs to be shared. At the HOA Stories, we believe in giving a voice to those who've been wronged, to those whose stories deserve to be heard. We've all faced injustice at some point, but it's in those moments that we must stand tall and fight for what's right. Your fight for Grace is a powerful reminder of the strength we all possess when we fight for the truth. If this story resonated with you, don't just keep it to yourself. Share it. Let others know that they are not alone in their fight. Together, we can stand up against manipulation, lies, and injustice. Join the movement at the HOA Stories. Subscribe, like, and share this video to spread awareness. Your voice matters. Your story matters. At the HOA Stories, we are committed to telling the truth amplifying voices, and bringing justice to light. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update from the HOA stories. Together, we can make a difference.